Good morning, my friends. We are continuing, we're almost done, but not quite, with The Art of Supportive Leadership, Swami Kriyananda's wonderful book. We're in the last few pages and we're almost to the last chapter. It's been quite a dynamic experience to go through all of these profound lessons. And now we're coming into the home stretch. So let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to all. Dear Swamiji, guide us that we may understand your deeper intention in the words that you have written here. Elevate our understanding that we may act toward others as you always acted toward us, with kindness and clarity and deep commitment to the highest welfare of all the world. Om. Peace. Amen. So, my friends, here we are. We are still in the chapter called, it's chapter 11, and it's called Work with People's Strengths. And here's what Swami's saying now. In matters of leadership, never speak from your personal likes and dislikes, and especially not from a level of emotion. Speak from a sense of justice, of what is right and true. There is nothing so likely to win you disrespect from your subordinates as any uncontrolled display of emotion. I know this is not consistently, sometimes people say you have to, show you're tough and show your anger and all that, but that's just silly. If your goal is just to enhance your ego and reincarnate countless times, then that's the sort of thing you can do. If you really want to transcend and be free, then you have to think about it very differently. Now, what Swami is talking about when he says uncontrolled display of emotion and don't act from emotion, we have to make a distinction here between the difference between feeling and emotion. And we have to define our terms in English, because in English those words get mixed up and people don't really know what we're talking about. And so any not acting from emotion makes people, if you don't understand the subtlety of what he's saying, you'll end up thinking that you should always just be cold and impersonal. But that's not at all what he means. Feeling, chitta is what it's called in Sanskrit, is actually the fundamental quality of our nature. We don't want to be, as Swami said, we don't want to be merely conscious. We want to be conscious of having positive feelings. That's why the definition of God in Sanskrit is Satchitananda, ever existing, ever conscious, which means ever aware of itself, ever conscious, ever new bliss. There's no point in existing forever if you're not also having an experience of deep, uplifted feeling. So feeling is that aspect of our nature which makes life worth living, really, and bliss, which in Sanskrit the word is ananda. That's why Swami named Ananda Ananda, because that bliss is what we're all seeking in our lives. Love, money, power, friends, possessions, beauty, all of it, we want it because it gives us joy. And we're always seeking joy on a higher and higher level, through physical pleasure, through emotional fulfillment, through whatever it is. The intention is always happiness, which elevates to joy, which elevates to bliss. And it elevates because the more we are peripheral in our definitions, the more we think that my happiness will come from things that are way outside myself, the less ultimately satisfying it is. I remember when we had, when publicity was not on the internet but was through printed material, and we had this like 28-page, essentially a small magazine that we would publish every 4 months. every 3 months, once a quarter. And it described everything that Ananda was and all our programs and our staff. And it was a very important document, and we worked hard to make it beautiful. And from time to time, we'd have a better idea, so we'd revise it. And I remember working with a new designer who was very talented and worked on it for many weeks, and finally, had it printed and delivered. And I was so pleased with that piece of work. It was really a fine piece of work. It was beautiful. It was clear. It presented Ananda in an extremely magnetic way. It was just so gratifying. And it came off, it was printed, and then I had it. I sat down, I read every word, I looked at every picture from front to back. Then I did it again. And then I put it by my bed, and then I woke up the next morning and I looked at it again. And after the third time, the thought was really clear in my mind. I think I've squeezed all the happiness out of this magazine that I'm ever going to squeeze from it, and I just put it down. It had the capacity to please me because of all the work that we'd done, and seeing your work, it was very happy, but it was an inert object. I had that same experience when I got a new rug in the apartment I was living in then, and we had to send to Georgia to get the right color. It was a whole big thing. And, if you're going to do it, you might as well do it well. So we finally got the rug in, and I remember just sort of the furniture was still all moved away, and I remember just lying on my back, then on my tummy on the new rug and looking at the whole apartment and the new rug. But then I had the same feeling. It's like, this rug cannot love me back. It's an inert object. I can project upon it all this pleasure, but it's just an inert object. No matter how much I love it, it's just going to sit there. And if we poured red wine on it or black tea, something that can't be washed, can't be gotten out of it, the rug wouldn't care. It would just sit there. It has no consciousness. And so emotion is, let me just get this, the feeling of joy, the feeling of bliss even more, it's an inner experience that we have. And the more deeply we have it as the fact of our nature, joy is within me. The motto of Ananda is joy is within you. And the Satchidananda, the very nature of the divine within us, it's ever existing, ever conscious, ever new bliss. And the whole spiritual path is that we gradually recognize that even though we may project the cause of our happiness outside ourselves, all we're ever experiencing is the capacity for joy within us. That's feeling. That's citta. And emotion is when we have a feeling begin within us, but then we extend our consciousness outside ourselves and attach to some external reality the cause for our happiness, and therefore our happiness is now dependent on the behavior of that external entity. If my happiness was that I had a beautiful new home and the home burns down, then the cause of my happiness has been taken away from me and I'm plunged into grief. If I have great joy in God and loved making a beautiful home and the home burns down, let's be practical. Of course you feel disappointed and you realize this is a tremendous challenge and all that effort has been lost. You can be natural in your response. But one can also realize that my happiness did not depend on having that house. I had joy within me. As an expression of that joy, I made this house. Now I don't have the house, but I still have the joy. I may have a challenge in front of me because I'm going to have to rebuild this house. Swami talked about the time, it was the summer of 1971, a long time ago. He had just closed down his apartment in San Francisco. He had moved to Ananda Village. It was a big move because now he was depending on being able to generate the money needed to pay for the land from there. He had just gotten the basic buildings done, so they could begin to function at Ananda, there at the seclusion retreat, as it were. And it was actually 1970. And the temple caught fire. Somebody left a candle burning late at night, and it ignited the whole place and burned the whole temple to the ground. And it had taken so much effort for Swamiji to get that temple there. But actually, the cycle for him went like this. It burned in the middle of the night, and the next morning he was meditating. And he said, to God, I'm only doing this for you. I'm only doing this to serve my Guru's cause, to help others come to self-realization. So and the temple was never mine, it was always yours, and if you wanted to take it back, that was your will. And he got up from the meditation and he went out to a local store. And when he walked in, he was singing, just singing some happy song. And the clerk behind the counter said, because she'd heard about the fire, "You're singing," she said like that. And Swami said, "Well, I lost a temple. I didn't lose my voice." And she said, "When my house burned down," she said, "for months I cried every day." And Swami was sympathetic, but later he said to us, "Why waste all that time? Eventually you stop crying, so why not stop crying right away?" When he was driving up to Lake Tahoe with a group of friends to go skiing, and it turns out the tires on his car, which he thought had been changed to new tires, had not been changed, and the tires were bald, and it started to snow, and he hit the brakes, and the car skidded into a Greyhound bus, as it were. Which he says is very convenient because they were able to get out of their car and get onto the bus. But the car was totaled. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but the car was totaled. Interesting, just by the way, someone else had been driving, and just a few miles before that, somebody said, "Oh, I feel like driving. Why don't you let me drive now?" So Swami was driving when the accident happened. Perhaps that's what made it inconsequential for the people. And so anyway, the car was totaled. They had to call to have it arranged to be towed, and then they all got on the bus, and they were perfectly cheerful, and people were, again, sympathizing. "Oh, your car was ruined." And Swami said, "Well, in a month I'll feel fine. Why waste all that time?" Because if we have emotion, what happens to us is we're hanging out there. I think of it like this. Think of there's wonderful trees on our property, this huge oak tree that we have, elm tree. And it has a huge trunk like this, and then the branches extend way out from it because it's been here for, 50 or 70 years at least, maybe more than that. So often you're sort of some distance from the trunk, and when you look up, you're actually realizing you're still looking at a branch that came from that base. So the trunk is where the power of that tree is. You could cut off many or most of those limbs, and the tree would still live. It would just regenerate. It would create new limbs, a new form, but it wouldn't die because the life force is coming up through the roots, through the trunks, and then it's sending that energy out to the leaves. Well, feeling is the life force that comes out of the earth and moves through that trunk. And the water, and of course the sunshine is brought down through the leaves, so it's a cooperative effort with the whole of the tree, but the life force runs through the center of the tree. And as I'm saying, you can cut limbs, lots of limbs, the trunk is still unaffected. But so that's the feeling part of us, and it's literally true also, it runs through the center of us. Emotion is when we take that feeling. Now, bear in mind, the life force of the tree extends all the way out to the furthest branch, to the tiniest little twig, to the first little bud. It all emanates from the center of the tree. So it's not as if there's anything bad about reaching out like that and creating a tiny leaf way out at the edge. In fact, that's your job. So it's not as if we hold ourselves all in a tight bandage and refuse to move out of the trunk of the tree. The tree is just lavish in what it creates and what it gives, but it's always coming from the source. And so when we become emotional, what we do is we run out to the end of the branch, and then we make our home at the end of the branch, and we begin to think what's animating us, what's sustaining us, what our life force source is that little bitty twig at the end of the branch. whether that's the relationship I have, the job I have, the beautiful young body I have, the pleasure I have through that body, the money, the respect of others, the adoration of others, whatever it is, it's the end of the branch. And then something happens. There's a lightning strike. There's a big wind. There's a who knows what. And some rot sets in the middle of that branch. The branch breaks off. If you've made your home at the end of the branch, you crash to the ground. If you've made your home in the trunk of the tree, which is the real source, and that branch falls off, you may be heartsick. You may have deep feeling about the loss of what you were creating, but it's not the end of you. Okay? So this is, feeling is the source. Emotion is the misunderstanding of what the source of that happiness really is. And the misplaced identity with the periphery instead of the center. So, when Swami says, coming all the way back to here, in matters of leadership, never speak from your personal likes and dislikes, and especially not from the level of emotion. Speak from a sense of justice, of what is right and true. There is nothing so likely to win you disrespect from your subordinates as an uncontrolled display of emotion. The leader has to always be standing at the trunk, reaching out, creating, serving, supporting, sending energy, but always from the trunk of the tree. So when there is a kerfuffle at the end of the branch, which there are many kerfuffles at the end of the branch, because most people do not live from their center. So if you are the leader, you must never allow yourself to get drawn down to that periphery. You must stand at the center, look all the way to the periphery, but make your decision based on the strength of your own center. What is right, what is true, and not even your likes and dislikes. You know, if a leader shows favorites that are not based on merit, it becomes, disrespect is the word. Your subordinates will simply disrespect you. You know, teacher's pet, remember from childhood. It's just like, you can't have those kind of preferences. Swamiji was always scrupulously fair, just scrupulously fair. And if someone who appeared to be closer to him than someone else was in the wrong and someone else was in the right, he never. I remember a particular time when my behavior was less than exemplary, putting it mildly. And two of the people who worked with me just complained to Swamiji, and it was to the point where we had to have a little conversation, the four of us. And I became defensive. And I was resolved not to become defensive, but I did. As soon as I became defensive, Swami just gave all credit to my detractors. And I appreciated that he did that, because my behavior was wrong. It was just as simple as that. And I knew it. I slipped. I lost. I had too much emotion in it, and I slipped into that emotion. As soon as I went there, Swami was simply not going to back me. He just wasn't going to do it. And he was completely correct, and I was completely wrong. At the time, my annoyance was not with him, but with myself. Oh dear, I put Swami in an impossible position. He couldn't back me when I was sitting there being so defensive. How could he do that? Because it wasn't justice at that point. And I was showing him that their criticisms were accurate also, which was also true. You know, but I loved Swamiji for doing that. And there was no question, he wouldn't have behaved in any other way. So it's something we have to really cultivate. You know, in terms of speaking out of uncontrolled emotion, I have certain personality characteristics that I've been working with my whole life, and I've made great progress in them, but they're still there. I can be reactive. Because my brain works so fast and my mouth can keep up with my brain, it gets me in a lot of trouble because I can respond too fast. And I had trouble getting a hold of that reactive process, but I trained myself to recognize the external symptoms of that reactive process, which was the pitch of my voice and the speed of my words. And I trained myself that whenever I heard that tone of voice coming from me, and whenever I heard those words speeding up the way they would speed up in that, no matter what I was saying, it should not be being said, period. And so I didn't spend any time thinking about whether I was right, whether I'd been mistreated, whether this, whether that. As soon as I was in that vibration, I was wrong, period, wrong, and it had to stop. And when I was first really catching on this, literally, I would have to walk out of the room sometime because I couldn't get mastery of it, but I knew it had to end. And that was the beginning of my, at least, progressing on this issue. It's still a deep characteristic of mine, and I have to always be watching it. But I catch it faster, and I do it much less. So pay attention, because a part of what happens when you get emotional is that you feel so justified. Now, bear in mind, this does not mean that you never express yourself. This does not mean that you suppress your feelings. This does not mean that you always have to be nice. That doesn't mean any of that. But it means if you're going to take a strong stand, be sure that you're centered when you're doing it. And you're not just panicking because what you want looks like it's going to be threatened. So, now Swami has another last concept here. When dealing with individuals, put any prejudices you may have resolutely aside. You know, it's only natural to have an affinity with certain people and less of an affinity with others. We have many past lives, and we have many characteristics, and we have many preferences. You know, it's just perfectly natural. We're not trying to become inhuman. We're trying to become the highest octave of humanity, which includes deep personal ties that we cultivate over many incarnations. And as Swami said, you can love everyone equally, but you can't be equally close with everyone. Partly it's just because you have only one physical body and you have only 24 hours in a day. You just don't have that much time. But also, if you're a musician, you will naturally have affinity with people who love music. If you're a verbal person, you may naturally have affinity with other people who can speak your language and can express things to you. If you like a lot of silence, then you're going to tend to like more introverted people rather than those that make a lot of noise. There's just so many different factors. So he says, but when dealing with others, put any prejudices you may have resolutely aside. I had a very complicated life lesson that really was a powerful one for me. Years ago, there was an individual who lived in this community, and he had certain just personal characteristics that I was not, that I found a little hard to deal with. I had a hard time just relaxing and accepting the way the person was. Now I think I could, but this was many years ago. So I was always a bit cool toward them. And they were a perfectly nice person. It was just personality characteristics I didn't care for. I was learning to scuba dive, and I know these things sound very unrelated, but I was learning to scuba dive, and over 2 holiday times I was working on it. And I enjoyed it, but I had an odd moment of distress when I was first learning, and that anxiety sort of stayed with me. I eventually just gave up scuba diving. I loved it. I loved being underwater, but I never felt comfortable. I was always a little afraid. So this was the second year that we're going back to do this, and I wanted to do it, but I was also really scared. And I was so scared that I actually made myself physically sick. I mean, just, anxiety in the midriff and pain, and so, of course, I could have just not faced into it, but I rarely do physical things, and I never, or almost never do physical things that scare me. So I wanted to face it down. So when I'm very uncomfortable overnight and I'm praying to Divine Mother for mercy, and she wasn't giving it to me. I just wasn't getting any mercy from God. And I sort of asked an odd question, why, Divine Mother, why aren't you comforting me? And suddenly the picture of this person came up like this. And I felt Divine Mother say to me, well, when that person needed comfort, you didn't have anything to give them, did you? And the picture I saw in my mind was that by my own actions, I had created a universe that I now had to live in which comfort is only doled out if people like you. And just because you're suffering, that doesn't mean anybody cares. And that was precisely what I was experiencing. I was suffering and nobody cared. And Divine Mother said to me, well, you didn't care, so why should people care about you? And I knew for a fact, at least I felt it was true, that it was just one-to-one. Even though you would have thought it had nothing to do with it. But I had created a world in which compassion was doled out according to personal preference. That's not a world I want to live in, but it was the world that I was making others live in. So when it was my turn, that was the karma. And so I went scuba diving. I conquered the fear, blah, blah, all that happened. And I came home, and from that point on, I was so nice to that person. I mean, not because I had been wrong, and I knew I was wrong. And that's what we're trying to do as leaders. We're trying to overcome our own shortcomings. That's why we have the karma. You know, leadership is not good for everyone, but those who have the karma, it's an opportunity for us to work out karma. And working out karma means I have a lot to learn here. I need to move toward perfection in this role, or else I'll have to do it forever. Okay, when dealing with individuals, put any prejudices you may have resolutely aside. Think of others with empathy as their sincere friends, or as though you were perceiving them not at, but from their own inner center. Oh, that is such a lovely way, and it's way too much for me to talk about when I only have a minute left, but I'll start there tomorrow. You know, we all make perfect sense to ourselves. It's just the most interesting thing in the world. Because of my sometimes too quick responses to life, especially when I was younger, I used to say and do things that were not wise. And I have a friend a close friend who is always empathetic and always sympathetic to people. And I remember so many times I would just blurt out something, and she would just look at me with great empathy, but also with this incredibly puzzled look like, what could possibly have made you think that was a good thing to do? I mean, now it's funny, it wasn't funny then. But yeah, what could possibly have made... But it seemed like a good idea to me at the time. And I learned from that, you know, that we need to see the world through the eyes of others if we're going to know how to relate to them in a way that will be of benefit to them. And that's why we're here, after all. Not merely to just run our own tapes endlessly, but to grow and to help others also to grow toward the light. God bless you, my friend.